up until this point, we've only talked about the extent to which the French government collaborated with the Nazis and the general kind of maybe collaboration among some people in France. But of course, there was resistance on the part of the people of France as well. So I want to focus on this part of the lecture on the resistance itself. What you're looking at here is the Cross of Lorraine on the French flag. The Cross of Lorraine had been chosen as a symbol of kind of French nationalist unrest after the capture of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 by the Germans. So it had been used as a symbol to, I guess, a symbol of anti-German French nationalism, dating back to the 19th century, and in some ways was seen as appropriate as a new symbol for those who wanted to resist the Nazis during the Second World War. The most famous of the resistors, of course, was the man pictured here, Charles de Gaulle, who was a general in the French army. He had actually become a member of the cabinet of the French government in 1940. And as France was on the verge of surrendering in June 1940, de Gaulle, rather than kind of accepting his place in France, decided to flee to the United Kingdom to try and continue the French war effort from the UK. So he was only actually a minor member of the French government prior to 1940, but as the course of the war goes on, he becomes more famous. So I want to begin by showing you a speech that de Gaulle made in 1940 from the United Kingdom, trying to rally the people of France. So let's take a look, and thank you to Cora Kim for the translation provided here.
La défaite française a été causée par la force mécanique, aérienne et terrestre de l'ennemi. L'action foudroyante de cette force mécanique a amené l'effondrement du moral, du commandement et du gouvernement. Devant cet effondrement, deux voies s'ouvrent de l'abandon et du désespoir. Elles menaient à la capitulation. C'est celle qu'a choisie le gouvernement Pétain. L'autre est celle de l'honneur et de l'espérance. C'est celle que nous avons prise, mes compagnons et moi. Nous croyons que l'honneur des Français consiste à continuer la guerre aux côtés de leurs alliés, et nous sommes résolus à le faire. Nous espérons qu'un jour, une force mécanique supérieure nous permettra d'avoir la victoire et de délivrer la patrie.
So that speech, as it happens, not many people in France saw that speech because it was delivered in the midst of the chaos of the French surrender. But de Gaulle was in some ways lucky that Winston Churchill decided to recognize him very early on as the figurehead for French resistance to the Nazis. So you see him here, he actually gave, the BBC gave him a studio. He made regular broadcasts and propaganda messages to France trying to encourage resistance against the Nazis. And I said the British government recognized him. Churchill and de Gaulle, even though they often had serious fallings out, it was largely Churchill who maintained de Gaulle's relevance to the French war effort. The United States, on the other hand, and Franklin Roosevelt in particular, were much more indifferent about de Gaulle. Franklin Roosevelt did not like de Gaulle, and actually the American government recognized the Vichy government as the legitimate authority of France until 1942. So de Gaulle's biggest hope of trying to influence the war effort from London was to work with the French colonies around the world to see if he could get them to recognize him as legitimate representative of the French government. And one of the people who was willing to work with de Gaulle was Félix Éboué, who was an administrator in the French territory of Chad. So Éboué quite early on was willing to acknowledge de Gaulle as the legitimate representative of the French government. So Chad in some ways actually kind of defects to the de Gaullist cause and separates itself from Vichy France. And so that was de Gaulle's main hope, that the other colonies would do the same. But apart from Chad and a couple of colonies in equatorial Africa, there was a lot of resistance in the colonies to adopting de Gaulle, that the Vichy government was able to retain control of them. In French West Africa, for example, the Franco-British effort tried to capture here, this is Senegal, tried to capture Senegal, its capital Dakar, as a way of trying to break off French West Africa from Vichy control. This attempt was in 1940 and it failed. And North Africa, West Africa, most of West Africa at least, and Indochina, those colonies remained loyal to the Vichy regime. De Gaulle himself is a complex character. He wasn't always necessarily everyone's best friend during the war. In fact, you see here, this is a quote from de Gaulle himself: "Men can have friends, statesmen cannot." And well, de Gaulle certainly tried to live up to that maxim, in that even with Churchill, he was really totally reliant upon for any kind of relevance, he often kind of annoyed Churchill with his kind of intransient, strict interpretations of a variety of what sometimes seemed like kind of meaningless protocol. But he was very adamant that he was to defend the interests of the French government, the future France and its colonies, and anything that to him seemed like it might threaten that, he became quite prickly, and it was established a reputation for arrogance. We often think of the French as being particularly arrogant, but de Gaulle really kind of set a standard of pushing people, kind of testing their limits. Sometimes it might kind of reflect his own personality. I mean, de Gaulle himself, you understand, he was a French general who essentially had predicted in the mid-1930s that France's defensive approach to the war would not work, that a more kind of aggressive offensive style was required. And so he could have looked at the success of the Blitzkrieg in France in 1940 and said, this is exactly what I'm talking to you. So in some ways, we might say de Gaulle was kind of arrogant, but he also had a genuine feeling of, if I'd been listened to earlier, a lot of France's problems might not have arisen. So it's also worth bearing in mind, we talk about the resistance, that there's kind of two sections. There's de Gaulle and a number of French who escaped France, who make it to the United Kingdom, who kind of join his cause. And then there's the efforts of the resistance within France itself. And especially in the early years, there's actually not a lot of connection between de Gaulle and these people who are actively resisting the Nazis within France. It's only later on that the two forces kind of get linked. So the resistance in France itself oftentimes was a makeup of various different groups, oftentimes small groups, and at the beginning not very coordinated, who certainly didn't take any orders from de Gaulle. So de Gaulle was more a symbol of French resistance in the early years of the war, as opposed to actually maintaining any kind of level of control over the elements of resistance within France itself. Who joined the French resistance? What did the French resistance involve? At the beginning, it was pretty moderate. It was really, at the very beginning, nothing more than anti-German slogans and printing anti-German propaganda. Those who were living in France, occupied by Nazis, were very aware that the Germans were very, very brutal in their repressions of any kind of oppression or any kind of resistance. So one had to be very careful about not antagonizing, or at least if you were going to join the resistance, to be selective of what you did in order to resist. Those who joined the resistance actually tended to be from a wide range of sources. The left of France probably had the dominant number of figures, but there were those who had been involved in groups like Action Français, the Cagoulés, the kind of that terrorist group that I mentioned that was attacking the Popular Front government. It had a kind of wide range of figures who were involved. Jews were also disproportionately represented in the resistance. And women played a prominent role as well. The woman on the left here, Bertolt Albrecht, was actively involved in the resistance, and when she was captured by the Nazis in 1943, she committed suicide in order to prevent her from revealing any information under torture. So Albrecht was one of the leaders. There were female leaders in various resistance groups as well. And so this woman on the right I don't know her name, but this representing the fact that there were many women who were also involved in the resistance movement. But at the beginning, in the first maybe the first year, 18 months, there wasn't an enormous amount of direct action against German soldiers. It tended to be more sabotage, coordination, propaganda, precisely because they were aware that the reprisals Germans would take if there was any action taken against their officers. Situation changed. And what changed the situation? Sorry, I'm just trying to keep my mouse under control here. So what causes the situation to change? Okay. Jeopardy question. Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 was named after this Holy Roman Emperor, who was Frederick Barbarossa. So the Nazi invasion of Russia or the Soviet Union changed a lot, and what specifically changes, of course, is the attitude of the French Communist Party. The French Communist Party had largely resisted efforts to, or had essentially not participated in the resistance, kind of on the orders of Stalin, because obviously Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were neutral allies in the early years of the war. Once that changed, the Communist Party became quite active in engaging in resistance movements, and this was a boon for the resistance. I mean, the communists were a very well organized organization. They had connections across France and also had a lot of experience in operating kind of on the fringes of the law to begin with. But the communists caused controversy because they wanted to take more active resistance, i.e. shooting, killing German soldiers, bombing German army units. And this was oftentimes resisted by other members of the resistance because they feared the reprisals, and they weren't wrong to fear these reprisals. For example, in 1941, the summer of 1941, the communists assassinated a German officer in Paris, and the Germans executed 27 hostages they had in reprisal. And so this was one of the debates about the resistance. You know, is it worth the cost of German reprisals to try to attack the German soldiers? There were other elements in which people resisted. One of the most famous examples of French resistance was the village of La Chambon-sur-Lignon in the Massif Central in central France, where they hid hundreds of Jewish refugees from the Vichy and Nazi governments over the course of the war. So that's one example in which people, maybe not directly involved in fighting the Germans, but resisting the Nazi occupation nevertheless. In 1942, de Gaulle tried to coordinate more efforts with the resistance in France. He sent Jean Moulin, one of his representatives, to France to, on the one hand, try and organize these, because the resistance was broken into lots of different groups, to try and organize a kind of national council between them to make them a more cohesive military unit and to prepare them, kind of the subliminal message, to also accept the Gaulle's authority as their overall representative. And some resistance people did not like that idea. Some people had the attitude, de Gaulle left France, we're the ones who are staying and suffering in the Nazi occupation, why do we have to take orders from him? But Moulin was successful in creating a greater national cohesiveness amongst the resistance and encouraging them to prepare for their main goal, to prepare for an allied invasion of France, that they could join in the attack against the Nazis if and when that moment came. The resistance movement received a boon in 1943 when Pierre Laval, realizing that it was hard to get get French people to volunteer to join the labor or to essentially go work in German factories, made it mandatory. And in response to this mandatory obligation, essentially where French men were being drafted to work in German factories, many French men simply headed to the countryside and became known as the Maquis. That is the name from the kind of the scrubland, or the kind of the hilly scrubland terrain in parts of France. So these are essentially were people on the run, who were on the run from being forced to work in Germany, and instead decided to join the resistance as well. So this was a new boon for the resistance. That being said, there were those who collaborated with the Nazis as well, and increased their collaboration as the Nazi war became more desperate, and the Nazis became more willing to work with French Nazis themselves. And one famous example was Joseph Darnand, pictured here, who established the Milice Française, the French militia, essentially a pro-Nazi paramilitary group who began carrying out searches for Jews, attacks against the resistance, espionage and spying on resistance members, and actively collaborated with the German war effort in suppressing the resistance themselves, and were very, very controversial figures in that regard as well. So the resistance, on the one hand, we have de Gaulle outside of France trying to coordinate and be a symbol for the resistance, and trying to coordinate the empire as part of the effort to liberate France. The resistance itself engaged in various military and propaganda efforts against the Nazis in France, but of course also fighting against some of their Frenchmen like Joseph Darnand, who were active and willing participants for fighting for the Nazi cause.